So hatch, go to CAD Common here, arch 1310, coordinate, oh no, coordinates, let's see, drawings, and hatch demo. Okay. All right, so let's talk about hatch, and I'm going to open up I'll open up a floor plan over here. Let's see, my favorite AIA layers file. And this one doesn't have any layers, obviously. But essentially, when you are normally looking at, oh, sorry, let me just, look at a floor plan. Floor plan, AutoCAD. We'll find a good image of one. Printed image. Okay, here's a pretty good printed image of an AutoCAD floor plan. Well, although it's blurry. Let's see if that one's blurry. And although we're not kind of zoomed into it, I want you to notice that there is some patterning on this floor plan. Sorry, let me grab one that we can see a little better. All right, same website. All right, I guess we'll just look at it. Proving to be more difficult than I thought. Anyway, we'll just look at this one here. All right. So as we look at this floor plan, there is some patterning in this floor plan. And the patterning is in the form of a dark, what we call hatch in the walls. Okay. Essentially, you're going to hear the terms hatch, low. You'll hear the term poché. But essentially, that is just going to be patterning on your AutoCAD drawings, right? Or if you were hand drafting, it would be the same terminology. I'm trying to find a good example of, well, that one doesn't have a lot of patterning in it. Let's maybe open your book, actually, or maybe I can find your book here. I'm a little unprepared, it looks like. And on page 2, where is it? Okay, page 2-51, at least that's what it is in my book. It says dimensioning drawing assignment, okay? And it's a little floor plan, and let me see if I can, no, of course not. Anyway, so in that booklet, you see the floor plan, and you see that we have a lot of poché on that floor plan. And the poché comes in the form of a solid hatch, right, or poché in the walls, and it comes in the form of, you know, kind of a herringbone pattern in the kitchen, and in the bedroom we have a basket weave pattern, and in the bathroom we have a tile pattern, right? And so hatch patterns or poché patterns, they represent, you know, different things in a floor plan, on any floor plan or section or elevation, okay? In this case, the poché is indicating in the kitchen a floor finish, right? So, you know, it could be wood, it could be brick, it could be, you know, some other material arranged in that herringbone pattern. But essentially, having that hatch on the floor is indicating that there's something there, right? We have in the bathroom, you know, maybe like a 4x4 tile indication on the bathroom floor, right? And using a hatch, we can indicate that. In the bedroom, we have the basket weave, and maybe that's indicating carpet tile, right? So these, in this case, are showing floor finishes. Now, the walls, and this is generally, I'm not going to even say generally, it's just good, it's a standard, right? With your walls in an architectural floor plan, you're going to hatch them. And you're going to hatch them probably a dark black, you know, a solid black is going to be a little too dark, but a solid gray hatch. And this is to kind of further reinforce the idea that when you cut a floor plan, right, you cut the floor plan at a 3-foot distance above your floor plate, right, and you look down in. When you look down in, you see the floor plan, right? Well, this floor plan, to kind of accentuate the idea that that is the thickest line on the drawing, you hatch it solid, right? So not only do we have two thick, very thick, our thickest lines, defining the walls, which define the cut, you also then have the solid hatch that indicates it's even more thick and more solid, okay? So hatch is used to indicate different things on drawings. If you, let me just flip a couple of pages. So if we go to page 2-59, which has an elevation, the front of a house drawing on it. When you look at that, hatch is used to indicate kind of the same things, right? We don't see a cut line like in the floor plan, but we do see, you know, the brick wainscot showing, right? So it's indicated with hatch. And in the windows to indicate glass, right, or glazing, we see a solid light gray hatch, right? So these, in this case, on an elevation, hatches are indicating materiality and material changes. And then same thing on your, if you turn the page and you have the interior elevation of the kitchen, right? In this case, with this interior elevation, the interior walls have been cut. So on the very outside edges, you do see a solid gray hatch in the walls, indicating the walls have been cut, right? But then on the, you see on the tile backsplash, right, you have a hatch. And then you see in the cabinetry on the right, you have a hatch to indicate it's been cut there as well, right? So those are just kind of typical things that you're going to use hatch for, okay? Going back to AutoCAD here, okay? Let's see. Okay, so you see that in all these floor plans, right? I was trying to get a good example, but you can see it, right? The walls are hatched here, walls hatched, everything. This one has actually a black hatch in it, which is good. It's not incorrect. It's just slightly more of a contrast than I kind of like, right? So I'll usually do kind of a dark gray. Okay. So normally, and up to this point, if I asked you to create something like a floor finish, right, on your floor, the only way that you would know to create that would be with drawing lines, right? You'd have a hard time doing maybe the solid hatch, right, because you don't know how to do fields of solid color yet. But if I said, hey, will you draw a tile pattern in the bathroom? You would probably come over here and go to line, and you would maybe draw a little boundary right here, right? And then we could draw a line there, offset it. Maybe this is a 4-inch tile, so you're going to offset it equally on both sides. L for line. And we're going to EX, enter, enter, click. Oop, click, 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 right? And then O for offset. 2 inches on either side to get a 4-inch tile. I'm trying to center the tiles in this space, and that's why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it. I grab these two, I delete, O for offset, 2 inches, right? And I would go about just, oop, not 2 inches, sorry. Offset 4 inches. And I would start clicking away and creating my tile pattern on the floor. Okay? So you can see that, you know, without the tool that I'm going to show you next, this can actually be pretty time consuming, right? And there is actually a lot of cleanup that ends up happening when I try and draw a hatch kind of this manual way, right? EX, enter, enter, and I can extend these, keep going, right? You guys get the idea. So I'd have to trim out all of this and get this all going. I could copy it, CO, but the idea is that it just takes a really long time to generate this if I don't have a better tool to do it with, okay? So I'm going to just undo and get rid of all that junk in there. and we're going to switch back over to our Hatch demo, and I'm going to show you how to use Hatch instead. Okay. If we go to the, well, actually, sorry, we're going to type BH, or you can type Hatch. Okay. BH is boundary hatch. Okay. And when I type that in, I get this Hatch dialog or tool palette popping up here. Pause. You are being recorded right now.
Then never mind.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, everybody's really paranoid about it. When anybody comes up here, they ask if they're being recorded. I can come over there. Do you want me to come over there?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, he's fixing my laptop. Hold on. Okay, so let's talk about how we actually generate Hatch. Okay, Hatch is a command, and it's like text. Where if I go to like the annotate tab, I have some styles, but I don't have the full kind of palette of tools available to me, right, until I initiate the command. If I go to home, I do have the Hatch command, which is right here. Okay, and I can do Hatch, gradient, or boundary. We're just going to stick with Hatch for today, right? So I can create Hatch, and I can initiate the command, but the full palette of options doesn't pop up until I actually initiate the command, right? So I can't go anywhere and find this tool palette unless I'm actually in the Hatch command, okay? So a few things. I'm going to define some of these tools in here before we get going. We have a pick points option. We have our sort of menu of hatches available, which means these are all of the different patternings I can hatch with right now. Okay, this is a gallery view. This drop down right here allows me to pick, I guess it kind of filters my gallery, right? So I've got all of my patterns available here. If I want to choose just a gradient, then I choose gradient right here in this hatch type. And really the gradients pop up, right? So it brings me there. I can choose the color of my hatch. We're going to leave this as use current, okay? Kind of so that it uses our layers to generate our hatches, okay? We have a transparency, so I can make my hatch solid or translucent. I can angle my hatch, meaning I can rotate it. And I can change the scale or the spacing of my hatch right here, right? These aren't bright, like they're editable right now, but we can change those once we create some hatch. We have a set origin, which allows us to choose where the hatch pattern begins, okay? And that'll make sense in a minute. And then we're gonna leave this annotative alone for now, but we do have associative hatch, which means it is associated with a boundary that we designate, okay? So our hatch will be associated or not associated with a boundary that we specify, okay? So those are all of the tools we're gonna use to generate and modify our hatch, all right? Let's talk about how we actually create hatch, okay? Hatch is a big monster in AutoCAD. It is generally pretty easy to use, right? So I can type BH, I can click on this icon, I can type hatch at the command line, right? I can pick a boundary, click, enter, and I have my hatch. Great, right? The problem with hatch, and you're going to find this as you start using hatch, is that it doesn't always go where you want it to go. Sometimes it flows into other places that you don't want it to go. Sometimes it errors out and won't allow you to complete an entire area of hatch you want to complete, like on a large floor plan, right? It has a lot of memory associated with it. So if you get a ton of hatch in your drawings, it can bog your drawings down and it crashes your AutoCAD file. If I were to pick the number one thing that crashes AutoCAD files, hatch. It's a love-hate relationship. So just know that, you know, it does generally work very well, but it can be finicky sometimes, okay? Although I have to say it, you know, it is pretty easy to generate, right? I click in a region, I can create some hatch. Okay, so we've talked about what hatch is used for. We know how to initiate the command and view the tool palette. One other thing I want to clarify before I get going on creating hatch, well, there's two things. Number one, when we generate hatch, it has to be in a closed region, all right? And what that means is that there can't be any gaps in the area that I'm trying to hatch, right? So this is, it's a polyline. Even if it were just regular old lines, it wouldn't matter, as long as all of the endpoints touch. Did you fix it?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Awesome. Okay, you know what? I should probably... I left my laptop in here one day because I set it on that table and forgot about it. Like all day and all night and the next day. Ugh. Okay. So this is a closed boundary, and it doesn't matter, you know, it can be a circle, a square, lines that are connected at endpoints, polylines. It can be any of those things, but there cannot be any gaps in the geometry boundary. So this right here, unacceptable. If I try and hatch in that region, right, if I click on hatch and I try and hatch, it says, hey, a closed boundary cannot be determined, okay? Now, these little gaps can be tiny. They can be so tiny that when you're zoomed out, well, watch it work now. But this always happens. I try and illustrate an error and it doesn't happen when I want it to. But when I try and hatch this area, of course it works. And I say that because AutoCAD is getting better at sensing that maybe there's just a little error, right? But you can be, you know, kind of zoomed. Anyway, you guys get the idea. You get the idea. You can be zoomed out like this, and there can be a little gap, and it just messes everything up, right? And so when I'm troubleshooting hatch, probably the first thing that I do is I make sure that all of my edges are connected and closed, okay? And that might include going around to every corner and doing a fillet. F for fillet, click, click. Oh, what did I do there? Is it just me or are things not working? F, okay. Okay, there we go. So if I do get an error and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, I don't see any gaps, I don't understand what's happening, this is the shape I want, it took me a long time to draw it, my first initial kind of troubleshooting measure will be to go around and use fillet on all the corners, right? Even if they look like they're squared off, F for fillet, click, click, and I fill, and usually that will take care of the problem, okay? So we have to have a closed boundary for hatching, okay? And you're going to want to create some layers made specifically for your hatch, right? So when we generate hatch, you're going to have essentially heavy, medium, light. So you'll for sure have three different pen weights. But you may actually, if you get really into drawing in AutoCAD, you may want to have 5. So maybe heavy, medium, fine, light, and thin, or something to that effect, right? But the hatch layer naming convention for hatch is probably going to be something like A dash hatch dash heavy, right? Or I think you could even, I'm trying to remember now, I think you can even just leave out heavy, like, oh, PAT, that's what it is, P-A-T-T, sorry, it's right below me there. A pat dash heavy, right? And then you could make that, you know, red or yellow. And then we could have another one, A dash pat dash medium, right? And A dash pat dash light. And A dash pat dash fine. And A dash pat dash gray, like a gray tone, shaded, right? Something to that effect. By far and away, I think you're probably going to use a lot of the finer pen weights for Hatch. Some of these heavier ones may be appropriate for things like a dark floor finish, right? Like a tile pattern or something to that effect. But when you graphically look at a lot of floor plans that have hatching in them, the ones that look more appropriate have a lighter hatch, okay? And so with that said, I look at these and maybe my heavy is not red. Maybe heavy for hatch is, you know, cyan, right? And then medium is maybe magenta. And light, right? I'm just grading down, but I'm starting at a lower pen weight. The light is maybe gray, right? And then we have fine, and that will be something down here in the 250 range, right? Which is a gray tone, okay? And then we have gray, which will be a lighter gray tone, like 253, okay? Okay, so we have to have a closed region. We have to have, you know, the appropriate layers designated. Good stuff. So let's talk about how we actually generate hatch, all right? There's some weirdness with hatch generation too. And the weirdness is in how AutoCAD senses things in your drawing, okay? We have kind of a normal hatch generation where hatch is generally generated by clicking in a region, right? And when I click in that region using the hatch command, it sends out a ray trace. I'm trying to think of it. I think it's called a ray trace. It sends out a ray trace, and that kind of senses the boundary of where my hatch is going to go, okay? So in a normal hatch selection, I click in this boundary, and if I click there, you can see on this graphic, it essentially hatches the full region that I'm in. It skips a region, and then it hatches the next fully enclosed region. So it hatches, skips, hatches, skips. That's a normal hatch selection, like this first one. So it leaves what are called islands, okay? These little areas that are enclosed like this. Hold on, let me. Oh, an ActiveX object. Okay, never mind. It does it jumps regions. So hatch, skip, hatch. Okay, that's a normal selection. We have the outer boundary where whatever boundary I click in, it hatches and it doesn't skip and hatch anything else. Okay, and then we have ignore the islands, which it just hatches over the top of everything regardless of if I have, you know, some geometry inside of that object. Okay, so we have normal selection, outer selection, and ignore the islands. Okay, so if I look at, for example, this little piece of geometry here, to initiate the hatch command, I can come up here and click on hatch. I can also BH, which is boundary hatch, enter. All right. To find these selection types, I'm going to click on my options area right here, and I have create separate hatches, I have outer island detection, and I have send behind the boundary. So this area right here is where I'm going to choose what kind of hatch selection I prefer, right? I don't find myself changing this a whole lot, honestly. And funny enough, I probably actually couldn't tell you normally how I have it set it in my AutoCAD, right? When I'm just doing normal drafting or whatever. I would assume that maybe I kind of have it set to outer. I bet outer, right? And I would assume outer because this will allow me just to click in any region I want, right? It's custom almost, as opposed to normal where it kind of jumps the boundary and goes into a different area, right? So I'm going to click on options. I'm going to change my island detection to, we'll just we're illustrating it right now, to normal. Okay. To create hatch, I'm going to, by default, down here at my command line, pick points is sort of initiated when you initiate the hatch command. Pick points means click inside a boundary where you want to create hatch. Click. And my normal hatch selection, I click, it generates the hatch. Right now it's just showing a preview. To establish the hatch, I hit enter. Enter. Okay. If I come back and I click on the hatch, it's all one piece. It's all one region, right? It has one grip. I can move it. Okay. And I can delete it if I want to. Now let me change my layer to a heavy pattern layer. I'm going to come up to hatch, click. I have my pick point, which is the default selection method for hatch. Okay. Next thing I can do is, I'm going to skip that for a second, but I'm going to choose the kind of hatch I want, right? So by default, I have a solid hatch picked, right? If I click on solid, I hatch again, click, enter. Another solid hatch is generated. All right. Let me show you what this solid hatch looks like when it's printed. Window. Okay. So a solid hatch that has a solid color associated with it, even if it's like magenta, will print black. Okay, if I change this to, let's go to light, which is gray, still in the solid color family, previous plot, preview, still dark, right? If I change this to my gray tone, which is a 250 color, right? So if I look at my layers, any of these tones right here, these gray tones, they start to not print solid black. So if I preview this, then I start getting the grays, okay? So when you start using hatch and you think, oh my gosh, it's so dark, how do I fix it, right? It's really a matter of changing the color of the layer it's on. All right, so I'm going to click and delete that hatch. Let's create a different kind of hatch. I click on hatch. I'm going to choose maybe this brick one. Click. I click inside my boundary, click, enter, and I have created a brick hatch. Okay. It doesn't, if I click on that piece of hatch, right, I can delete it or move it. When I click on that hatch one time, I also kind of get these editing tools back. So if I wanted to, for example, change the hatch, click, I could. Concrete, right, and get it looking the way I want it to. One thing you're going to notice about this hatch is that, there's definitely a size associated with this hatch, okay? And if I click on it, I've got my scale up here of the hatch. Good morning. I've got the scale here, and I can change the scale. I can make it larger, right? And you see that the hatch sizing changes, and I can lower it, right? And make the pattern smaller. Smaller to the point almost where it actually looks kind of solid, right? Which is kind of a common error that you see happening and freaks you out a little bit, right? You look at it, you think you created brick looking hatch, right? But in fact, it kind of looks solid, okay? So I can grab my hatch, I can change the scale of it, I can even click and type something like 4, enter, 1, enter, and change the hatch of the scale. Okay. If I click on my hatch, I can change the angle of it, right? So I can change the scale, make it look whatever size I want it to. I can change the angle. If I use my little slider here, you see that it kind of do, right? And it changes angle. I could also just type in a number, 45, enter, and I get a 45-degree hatch. Okay. I'm going to click on my hatch, and I'm going to make the angle 0. There we go. All right, so this is a normal selection, right? Let's look at the outer selection. I mean, it obviously makes sense that it's going to look just like this one, right? So I'm going to go to my hatch command, and I'm going to choose whatever hatch I want to use. Let's use kind of the same one as that one maybe, which is a diagonal up like that. I'm going to change my, before I forget, my island detection from normal to outer. Now when I click inside that boundary, it just clicks, or it just creates hatch in the boundary that I select. Okay, so if I come up and I click on hatch again, I could, you know, click, and hatch is a chain command, so I can just continue to create hatch, click, 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 enter, there we go, right? When I created all this hatch over here, I successively click, 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 right? And then I hit enter. Now by clicking all those different times and hitting enter, it essentially glued all those regions of hatch together, right? So if I delete this, it deletes everything, right? So by default, unless you change it, all of these hatches are going to be generated in the same region, right? Now we have another setting. There's lots of settings for hatch, and they're a little bit hidden in my opinion. But under options again, you're going to notice we have a create separate hatches button. Click. And what that does is it allows you to create different regions of hatch. So click, click, oop, click. Ooh, see, it's already starting to be funny on me. Let me delete all these. Kind of freaking out probably because of the other hatch. Hatch, click, click, oop, ooh, no, it's not liking what I'm doing. Let's do these over here. I'm going to do these. But I can click in these different regions, enter, and because I chose separate hatches, even though I created those hatches within the same command, they are separate regions, okay? It doesn't seem like a big deal right now, but when you've spent, you know, an hour hatching a floor plan, you don't want to have to delete the hatch all in one fell swoop because something goes wrong, right? So this separate hatches option I think is a really, really helpful tool. And that again is under options here, create separate hatches. Okay. One thing I want you to notice about hatch before we go back and look at a couple more of the inputs over here, I want you to notice that if I have text created and I hatch after the text has been created, it creates a nice little box around the hatch, right? So your text is readable, okay? And I can grab it and I can move it, right? And it sort of follows it. Now, if I were to hatch something first, and then I were to add my text, I would get that, right? It wouldn't associate with that, that object. So essentially when I have text in a region I'm going to hatch, it acts as almost a boundary and the hatch hatches around it and it follows it, right? And if not, then the hatch kind of slashes through it. So if you're planning on putting hatch like in a floor plan you're drawing, right? Then you'll want to add your text first and then do your hatch. And in general practice, I think it's just good practice to honestly create your hatch very last. It's one of those things where you get all of your drawing done, you get all your details done, you add all of your text, and then you add your hatch, right? And it's because it's kind of hard to manage once it's generated, right? Hatch does stretch. You can trim it off if it goes over a boundary. You can move it. So it is a little bit editable, but you just have sometimes it's not always as easy as that, right? You have problems with it. And so in my best advice with this is to be able to create everything else and then to add your hatch in, okay? All right. Okay. So there are different ways that we can add hatch. We'll do ignore just for the fun of it, even though I think you guys kind of understand how that functions, right? I choose my options, ignore, right? Click, enter, there we go, right? If I click on my hatch, obviously I select it. I can change the pattern. I can change the scale, right? I can up this scale. Okay. Type it in if I want. I can alter the angle, 45, enter, and I can make it transparent if I need to, right? Transparent meaning if I wanted to show, you know, a lighter pattern or show items through other items, okay? It's a pretty nice feature actually. Okay. Any questions so far? Not too bad. Okay. A couple other things about Hatch. One thing specifically, and this has gotten a little bit better since, you know, way back when I first started using AutoCAD. When you are creating Hatch in general, if it's not working, a good practice is to make sure that the object you're hatching is entirely visually on your screen. Or, you know, if it's slightly off the screen, that's okay. But for example, if I have a floor plan, right, and of course it always works when I try and error, but if I'm I'm zoomed in and I want to hatch my walls a dark hatch, I come up here to my hatch command, I choose solid hatch, and then I go to click and it says, hey, a closed boundary cannot be determined, and you're thinking, you know, I went around and I filleted all the corners and these are all polylines and everything's, you know, appears to be working, right? Well, maybe it's not working. This is actually a new feature because back in the day, if you had a hatch boundary issue, you would have to just go and search it out. And still you kind of do have to search it out, but AutoCAD at least kind of, those little red dots are hints as to, hey, maybe this area could use some attention, right? Maybe you should regenerate this area. But I think that more so the problem I was having with what I was just trying to do was that I had only a little portion of this on my screen, and so AutoCAD had a hard time sensing the entire boundary I wanted to hatch, right? So the second I kind of zoom out, immediately I can hatch, right? Which is a pain in the neck when you've got a gigantic floor plan you're trying to hatch, right? And you're thinking, how am I going to hatch this entire region? And you know, the walls look microscopic at a certain point. So how do you hatch the, you know, certain floor plans? And I guess in pieces is what ends up happening. But anyway, that can be one thing that can happen as well. You'll want to have your the entirety of the object you are trying to hatch on your screen. Okay. All right. So things we're going to hatch. And let me just cheat. I'm going to delete that hatch. Oops. Here we go. Let me put this in here. Little cheater, huh? I've already got my layers created in this drawing, and so I wanted to hatch a little bit in this drawing, right? But essentially, when I hatch this, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to choose the color of the pattern I want, so maybe gray. I'm going to click on hatch, right? I'm going to choose solid for the walls, and really I'm just going to kind of come in here and start hatching walls, right? Enter to reinitiate my command, click, enter, enter, click, enter, right? And I start hatching all my walls. And I can do a quick little print preview. Let's take a look at it. And I've got my hatched walls. Okay. When I'm hatching something like a room, okay, there's a few things we have to kind of think about when we're doing a room. If I wanted tile or something on the floor here, and I go up to hatch, right, and I choose whatever pattern I want. Let's just choose something like the herringbone for now. I hover in here, I click. Oh, and I have my boundary to ignore, so of course it goes into my plumbing fixtures, right, which maybe I don't want. So I'm going to BH, I'm going to change my boundary, oops, to ignore, or outer, okay. Click, enter. Okay, good. But now I have this area in here where there's a door and there's a tag and there's this panel that I haven't, put hatch in. And if I go to hatch, BH, and I click in the door, you know, obviously it's going to try and sense this entire region, okay? So drawing what we call thresholds, right? You're going to draw a threshold across that door. Makes sense, right? And then BH, enter, and I am going to fill these little areas up with hatch. And you're thinking, well, what about the door tag, right? Well, that probably wasn't, I probably shouldn't have, you know, put hatch in the door tag. So maybe I've changed my mind, right? But that is a pretty good indication of hatch, or representation of hatch. In this room over here, I would do the same thing, right? I would draw these areas of boundary, thresholds, and BH, enter. Grab all of these, and there's my hatch, okay? Now I'm going to do a little print preview. And my hatch looks pretty good, right? Oh, although I got a little in there. But if I, for example, had this hatch on a different layer, something like heavy, let's look at what that would look like. Right, too heavy. This is kind of the #1 error that beginning students make with hatching in AutoCAD. So I just want to let you know it's not necessarily what you're doing, right? You just have to make sure the layer color is correct so that you get the right pen weight associating. All right. Another thing I want to show you, and I'm going to come down here to my little objects, right? So when I click on my hatch, it's one object, right? If I change the layer, it's one object, okay? If I M for move, and I move this, and I click on it, it's still one object, but you notice that I have these little grips all around the boundary now, right? By moving that hatch outside of its defined boundary, I've made it not associated with its boundary anymore, okay? So it's become non-associative hatch. And I can use these grips, and I can alter the boundary. And you might think, well, why is that helpful? What does that do for me, right? But it can do a lot when you have hatch that is going somewhere where you don't want it, right? And you don't really want to regenerate all of the hatch you just created. You just want to alter it a tiny bit. And so using these boundary grips is pretty useful to manipulate things that otherwise would kind of be stuck, I guess, right? So I can move that hatch and disassociate it with its defined boundary. If I don't want to move the hatch, but I want to use the grips to edit it, I can click on the hatch, and we have an associative button here. If I click on that, it removes that association without having to actually move the hatch, okay? So now here, if I didn't want the hatch kind of at this corner, right, I could kind of drag it in, and instead of having to rehatch the whole region, okay, that's exactly what I wanted, right? And it looks the way that it should, okay? All right, so just I think a couple more things about hatch. There's always, when I think about doing a hatch lecture, I always think it's gonna, like, it's a simple topic, and it's actually so involved. I forget how involved hatch is. But there are just a couple more things you're gonna wanna know. Okay. The first thing is that, let me go into our menu here, our gallery. We have a lot of predefined hatches, right? But we don't have every hatch that we need, right? And likely the most common hatch that you'll use is going to be the tile hatch, and we don't have a tile hatch here. We've got brick, we've got, you know, earth and dots and, you know, wood floor or whatever. They have weird names, but we don't really have a tile hatch here, right? So how do we kind of fix that? Well, AutoCAD has what's called a user-defined hatch, okay? And a user-defined hatch is essentially line patterns. So if I click on user-defined, I've got this this hatch, this line hatch essentially that I can define. And the user-defined part of it is that I can give it a dimension. So I could type in, you know, 6 inches, enter. And I could hatch a region, click, enter. And those lines would be exactly 6 inches apart, all right? These lines, this hatch, this is really dependent on the scale that you use to generate it. Like this has a scale of 1. And when I measure it, distance, I get somewhat of like 2¼ inches, right? So I can, using the scale, and to be honest, I can't really give you a good sense of what a good scale is, because for smaller drawings, it's going to be different for larger drawings. Like LT scale, I can say use half the scale factor, right? But for Hatch, I've never found a really good method to say something like, well, it's the same as a scale factor, or it's, you know, start with 2 and go whatever. Yep.
Can this work kind of like your plumbing fixtures? I remember how you could go into like Kohler and you could find like a sink.
Yeah.
If you wanted to use a certain type of flooring, you could go in and search the flooring.
You can.
Hatch format.
You can, yes. So you go out and you find what's called a PAT file for AutoCAD, but it's just not, honestly, it's not very easy to use. If we have time at the end, maybe I'll talk about it, because essentially what you have to do is you have to go find the files. Like if you go to Harris-Stone or whatever, you can go find their .pat files. You copy them and you paste them into the AutoCAD support files where they have their .pat files, and then they show up here, right? So that's a good question, actually, because hatches, you want to represent exactly what you're trying to represent. Where are they located? Usually it'll say go to here and drop them in. So this is where you have to go for Vista, Windows Vista New, or Windows XP. For AutoCAD 2009 and earlier, you're going to go here. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe we can get it. Maybe we have a keyboard command now. App data. Oh, nope. Didn't work. Anyway, it can be done. You just have to go find the PAT file, pop it into the support folder, close AutoCAD, reboot AutoCAD, and it should show up in your gallery. Yeah. But, you know, honestly, I rarely do that. There may be 1 or 2 times where I know I'm using like a stone pattern, and that's really the only one that I can't find usually. So if I'm using a stone pattern, I'll go find it. But I can generally kind of make anything else work, really. But the scale of these is just going to kind of be visual. That's how I manage it, right? So I look at it, I can measure it, say distance, and I can say, oh, this is, you know, 2 inches. Yeah, I wanted about 2 inches. Great, we'll keep it at that scale, right? But if it comes in and you have to change the scale to 200, that may be right. And if you have to take the scale all the way down to 0.025, that might work as well, right? So whatever you need to input there to make your object look the way you need it to, do that with Hatch, okay? Our user-defined Hatch, right? So this will get you kind of closer to being able to really very easily define these. So these lines, 6 inches apart, great, right? If I want to click on that, I can change that to 2 inches, enter, and I get a 2-inch hatch, right? So you're thinking, great, I can do wood floor, right? But what about tile? How do I indicate tile? Well, if I click on my hatch, and this would be something that you'd have to search for if somebody didn't tell you, but under properties, there is a double option. Okay, so I can double it and it looks like tile. And it doubles at the 2-inch increment, so those are 2 by 2 little tiles, right? I can make this, 4, and it would be 4 by 4-inch little tiles. Okay. All right, let's see. Any questions on hatches so far? Not yet, right? I think in your assignment, so in the back of your book, right, we're going to do dimensions next time. So I'm going to have you hatch and dimension actually probably at the same time, because you probably haven't finished drawing your little office space yet, right? But I think we're going to get rid of the dimension drawing assignment on page 2-51. I'm not going to have you do that. Instead, I'm just going to have you add the dimensions and some hatch to the office building drawing that you're generating, because we're getting kind of to the point where we're almost at our final project, And so I think it's a lot to do an office building and then to draw that little floor plan, and then we're going to draw some elevations and then start your final. So we're going to do the office building, and then we're going to, we have some elevations to draw. We'll talk about XREFs, and then really we'll be at our final, essentially. Okay, let me just make sure I didn't forget anything with regard to hatch here. I don't even think I'm going to have you do the hatch assignment. I think I'm just going to have you hatch the floor plan, the office space that you do, instead of doing the hatch assignment. Anyway, I think hopefully you guys got a pretty good idea of how hatch is going to function. Okay. Let me just make sure there isn't anything. I keep thinking there's something I've forgotten about hatch, but maybe, oh, match properties. Yes, how could we forget match properties? The best. Match properties works on hatch, and it's the best thing ever, okay? And what I love about it is that I can, match properties is just great in general, but I can draw little kind of swatches of hatch off to the side of my drawing. Right, so I could do these, I could do click, 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 and I could do some hatch, BH. See if I have my separate hatches. Yep, okay. I've got all these separate hatches, and if I wanted this one to be herringbone, MA, enter, click, click, and it matches. Isn't that magical, right? MA, click, click, looks good. What's nice about this is that you can create these little swatches, and then as you need them in your floor plan, you just match back and forth, right? Instead of going to BH, boundary hatch, going up, using a pick point, changing to the style you want, changing the scale every time, right? You just create 5 or 6 of these that you really like and that graphically look correct in the drawing you're in, and then you match back and forth from your drawing, okay? Now, don't be confused. You have to have something in here to match it to, meaning I can't, you know, sort of type MA, match properties, click on this, and then click in air to get that hatch to generate, right? In that region, you have to have something there to match it to. Okay, just one thing. All right, any questions so far about hatch? Okay. All right, so I think what I'm going to do for your assignment, you have the office space, and I'm going to add a little bit more requirement to the office space, and I'll extend the deadline. And I think what I'm going to have you do, you'll be adding hatch, okay? So I'm going to have you add hatch to the walls, and I think a couple of different areas, like maybe I'll have you add hatch to each of the individual little workstations, and then maybe to the storage room, right? So I'll post a picture of what I want you to make this look like with hatch on Canvas, okay? All right, stop recording.